Mushoku Tensei episode 17. Come on, who else cried? But I see from last episode a bunch of you guys thought the manga did it better. Do you agree? So smash that thumbs up if you teared up too. I woke up at 5 AM to get this out, and we need to jump into this. The anime skipped an episode and a half. Freaking yes, Paul's point of view. So here's what magically got nuked from the anime. Paul actually lucked out, he got teleported close by. It was a place towards the south that Paul had spent time in. Lilia's hometown, back when he was learning the water gun style. Although Paul hadn't stayed too long in this area, maybe a year or two? And yes, the memories just came flooding back to him. Here's where he got some info about Paul. He thought back to how the students in the hall were trying to keep him in his place. Not that Paul took too kindly towards that. It was the whole reason he actually ran away from home. But it really didn't matter, Paul sped past them. While they were still beginners, this guy was already intermediate rank. He recalled how even the master of the hall had only reached advanced level in the water god style. Eventually Paul had enough of their BS, that he had his way with Lilia just to get back at them, and then ran away. Paul had actually genuinely been interested in Lilia, although that didn't matter in this moment. Till this day, Paul still had regret about this, that he was so stupid back then, that taking out his frustration on Lilia wasn't his best moment. On the topic of Lilia, Paul recalled her teaching Aisha. Turns out that much like Rudy, this girl was also pretty talented, that Lilia was constantly trying to nurture this talent. Paul preferred to take the carefree approach, but Lilia would have nothing of it. Supposedly Aisha was not too special compared to Rudy, and that really only left Norn as his perfectly normal child. As for the whole teleportation issue, Paul recalled feeling something very similar, back deep in a labyrinth. Although that time, thankfully Paul had been teleported nearby. If you were unfortunate, one of these teleport traps could have instantly gotten you killed. Thankfully, the goddess of luck was on Paul's side since he got with Norm. He explained how teleportation magic moved you instantly. Thankfully, it also moved anyone you were in physical contact, which would explain his situation and also Rudy and Eris. But why, Paul wondered, what the hell was up with this random teleportation magic? It didn't make any sense. That there was no known incantation for teleportation. To teleport someone, you either needed a magic circle or a special magical item. Teleportation items were actually banned worldwide, and the actual creation of teleportation circles had been forbidden for such a long time now. It might as well have been considered lost magic. You do have to give Papa Paul credit for being a true trooper. He had cash stashed. Always prepared like the adventurer he is. Not only that, this guy still had his sword and actual adventurer card on hand. Funny how he gave Rudy all this crap, but he pretty much got handed a golden ticket. Right away, Paul actually headed to the nearby guild and charged his magic card. Paul went ahead and abused his S-rank perks to get that horse. He actually took on a quest to get it, though he had no intention of actually completing the quest. It was likely that Paul would lose his status as an adventurer due to doing this. Not that it mattered, Paul had no plans of going back to that life. You did get a glimpse of Norn getting sick along the way. Not too surprising, she had no experience riding a horse, and it really just showed how desperate Paul was traveling day and night. Time-wise, Paul didn't actually make it back to his hometown region for 2 months. Someone had pulled a Thanos on the whole Fitoa region, but where were Zenas and Lilia? This situation really made Paul recall his past adventures, specifically about teleportation traps within labyrinths, that there were one of the ways to get your party split up. Potentially it could get your entire party wiped out. Paul had experienced this very situation. Paul was fortunate to make it out of that predicament, but the rest of his friends were wiped out. With that in mind, Paul was now thinking back to his own family. What happened to them? Zenas had been a former adventurer, so she had experience. Lilia wasn't as good as her former self, but she still had experience using a sword. But how about Aisha? Had Lilia actually been touching her other daughter? As for the current regional political situation, Philip's older brother was currently serving as the acting lord. But turns out this guy was really just in a desperate situation, only focusing on himself. He hadn't taken any real steps to deal with the displacement incident. In the anime, you saw Paul meeting Alphonse, aka their Alfred, the Eris family butler. In such dedication, this guy was actually setting up the refugee camp, paying out of his own pocket. The butler dude here had actually heard about Paul from Rudy and of course Philip, so he asked Paul for his help. Paul accepted right away. 1 month after Paul got there, Paul went ahead and actually recruited the younger refugees in the area. They officially formed the Fitoa Search and Rescue Squad. Still, Paul had his priorities. It wasn't like he was playing this noble hero. At the very top of his mind was actually finding his family first. Paul went ahead and left that note behind in the refugee camp for Rudy. He eventually set out with his squad to make the home base of their operation over on the Miles continent. 6 months later, he had actually turned over to Zenas' family for some help. I think the anime skipped it, but Zenas is actually from a noble house. It was a family known for producing famous knights. Not only do they have real power on the Miles continent, they have quite the number of connections. So now you're getting into the meat of things. Paul had been doing everything he could to save every single slave from the region. He relied on his family connections as needed. It didn't matter if he was making enemies along the way. And nothing was gonna stop him. He was desperate to save people who needed help. Still, despite Paul's best efforts, he still hadn't managed to find any information on his family, not even Rudy. Before the guy knew it, an entire year had passed by. It is interesting to notice quite the development. The more people Paul helped out, the more slaves he freed. It just made the guy get even more hate from local nobles. Sometimes some of his own people got injured or killed, which then turned some of his squad against him. As time went by, the situation completely changed. They more and more started to discover about people who had already died. Naturally, Paul thinking about his family, he didn't take this too well. Still, during this time, Paul managed to save thousands. Paul even tried to reach out to his ex-party and have them search. He wanted to ask them to head over to the Demon Continent or the Big Red Continent. Unfortunately, Paul had only reached one of them, which should have been Geese. I don't recall if the anime has mentioned this, but the whole situation between Paul and his ex-party is a sticky situation. Let's just say they didn't part on the best of terms. A year and a half later, at this point the tragedy was officially known as the Displacement Incident. You're not going to be surprised to discover Paul hitting the liquor quite hard. The guy was always on that sweet nectar. Paul was literally never sober. And can you blame the guy? Paul couldn't help it. If he wasn't drinking, he would constantly be thinking that his family was already dead. He thought of ways they might have died. He pictured what happened to their corpses. This included the fate of his talented son. There was a real possibility of Rudy being dead. And it all went back to Paul. The guy really blamed himself and thought that they had died since Paul had not been fast enough. 6 months later, which should have been 2 years since the whole magical nuke. At this time, Paul's squad was actually trying to send people back from the Millis continent over to their hometown. 2 years and a sea of booze later, you can imagine the mental state of Paul. The guy wasn't going into these isekai meetings, he just drank his pain away. You should notice how it was really a dead end for Paul. 2 years out, they were going to cut out the search and rescue for the victims. It really just meant it didn't matter how hard Paul tried. The guy hadn't managed to get a single person of his family back. Since Paul was always as drunk as Tyrion, his squad guys slowly started to distance themselves from him. Of course, there were a few exceptions, like his daughter Norn. Paul had actually avoided going to the Demon Continent due to her. He had his daughter to take care of. There was no way he could leave her behind, potentially going to a place where he could get himself killed. For an anime skip, hey, it turns out Norn had actually met Rudyard a little bit earlier. You know, the big old guy having a soft spot for kids? He gave her a big red apple. And this really was the current state of Paul mentally. Norn meant everything in the world to him. If anyone tried to harm her or take her away, Paul would even be willing to fight against the Pope from the Millis Church if he needed to. Anyway, getting to present day in the bar scene with Geese. It's a little funny since Paul was still feeling Rudy's love from the previous episode. Papa Paul was just too prideful to actually get that healed. From last episode, I did get the sense that the anime didn't really get across how much Rudy played down his adventure. Paul here was still salty over Rudy's cooking. That if Rudy had so much time to tell him about the Demon Continent cuisine, he should have had time to do some other stuff with that time. But that wasn't the only place Paul was still hurting. Looks like that cheating accusation from Rudy really hit hard on him. Paul claimed he hadn't even thought about touching another woman in the last year and a half. But it was really much worse than Rudy really just being cheerful about his adventure. To Paul, it felt like Rudy was constantly bragging throughout his story. As for good guy Geese coming in to give his 2 Millis coins, he brought up Rudy going toe-to-toe with a North Saint smuggler. That Rudy was supposedly this type of genius you see once every 100 years. To which Paul completely agreed. Rudy was that prodigy, he was the genius. That his father Paul always had such high expectations for Rudy. He actually had Paul bringing up some family drama. That Phil, the guy that talked trash behind his back, had actually been won over by Rudy. So much that Philip was willing to marry his daughter off to Rudy. As a counterpoint, Geese did bring up a piece of Paul's backstory. Rudy was 11. On the other hand, Paul didn't even run away until he was 12. To which Paul actually agreed too. On the other hand, he had already concluded Rudy being above him. For this, he thought back to the fight. Sure, Paul had some alcohol handicapping him, but it was clear that Rudy had drastically improved. I mean, Paul went all out. He used the Norse god's 4-legged stance, and even busted out the sword god style silent sword. Rudy, on the other hand, wasn't even taking the fight seriously. Evidence to that was that everyone just suffered minor injuries. Paul further continued to beat himself up, claiming that he knew that when Rudy was 7, he was already smarter than him. Now in present day, Rudy was both smarter and stronger. So why had it been so unreasonable for Paul to expect more? He wasn't judging Rudy based on his age, instead based on his abilities. Paul then turned to Rudy's accomplishments. that Rudy now spoke 3 languages, and the dude was strong enough to take down an A-ranked monster by himself. Getting into the Demon Continent topic, you should really notice, and it should be emphasized, how much someone like Paul, who's never been there, doesn't know about its dangers. Even Roxy previously mentioned that just the people living there have it tough surviving the year. So this is really the heart of the issue. Paul had only heard about rumors about the place. The Demon Continent just sounded like a place with more monsters, which is something he could deal with, so Rudy should have no problem. Thankfully, Geese did try to clear up this whole misunderstanding. Here's what the anime skipped. That unlike their safe Millis or Central Continent, where it was safe, it was monster free most of the time, on the Demon Continent you would constantly get attacked by C-rank monsters, at a minimum. Just to get an idea of how that compares, on the Central Continent, to find monsters that dangerous, you would have to go really deep into the forest. Try that on the Demon Continent and you may become Cobra food. You saw Geese go down the list of challenges that Rudy faced. The anime skipped a good chunk of Paul trying to process this. First off, no real-world experience. Paul didn't recall Rudy ever getting into any actual fights, but he did recall him beating some kidnappers. Was he just giving Rudy too much credit? He actually thought he had a chance against Ghislaine at a distance. Keep in mind, Paul didn't know a single sword fighter better than Ghislaine, which translated back to Rudy should have had no problem. As a super topic, Paul really had limited knowledge about them, so little that Paul likely wouldn't have been afraid. To this, light novel Geese put much more emphasis on the super danger, that Rudy was put into a corner, he had no choice but to accept that offer. To this, Paul actually agreed that Rudy was this really sharp kid. Paul wasn't stupid, he actually realized what he did when he saved Lilia back then. It is funny to see the question from Paul, do the super even have a good side? To which Geese was really just trying to paint a picture of Rudy working with this demon dude. Let's be buddies, otherwise we might die. Thankfully, Paul was now starting to connect the dots and see the bigger picture. That Rudy did what he could, likely choosing the safest option given to him. To which I really love Geese's closing statement. That if Rudy was actually able to search the continent after being teleported, that alone should have been enough to make him one of the 7 great powers. Paul thought back to a dream of him actually earning that title and fame someday. He really felt that Rudy had the raw talent to make that list someday. And it wasn't just him talking. You should really notice how these past 2 episodes builds on Paul's last point of view, which the anime unfortunately completely skipped. It showcased his sometimes conflicted feelings on trying to raise Rudy. That Rudy never really needed Paul as a father. Then for the crushing moment saying that he should be happy that Rudy didn't come back with missing pieces. It would have been real nice if the anime left in the last part. If Rudy had died on the Demon Continent, there wouldn't even be a body left for you to find. On the other hand, you did have the anime beautifully turning this line into this nightmare scenario for Paul. In the anime, you did see Geese leave after this. So let's get into the rest of the Geese and Paul talk that the anime skipped. Quite a lot of juicy info and setup here. You did get a little bit of world building here, something he heard from Ghislaine. That for the Dodia tribe, being stripped naked, then put in jail, and then tormented with ice cold water was one of their greatest humiliations. They almost never resorted to this treatment, but if they did, usually it meant the prisoner's death. You heard that? Rudy was about to die. Geese then went on to actually reveal what he was actually doing in the Great Forest. That he just so happened to be in the area when he heard this rumor that some kid had gotten locked up. Good guy Geese had been going around all the tribes in the Great Forest. This dude had actually convinced him to send any lost people over to the Millis capital. So yes, Geese was this real MVP in the light novel. I'm not really sure about this next part, but this is what Geese claims. That he actually convinced some warriors in the village to throw him in jail with the kid. That this was all part of his grand plan. He was trying to help Rudy escape. You might be seeing why I'm questioning part of this story. He claims that he knew from the very beginning that he was Paul's kid. Partly due to this guy hitting on some of the beast ladies. Switching topics to a certain blonde elf. Oh, anime people are not ready for her return. Geese did mention Elanese and company heading over to the Demon Continent for Paul. That the elf lady here had already milked half of the men at the port dry. Paul was actually surprised about this. He recalled this blonde hating him more than anything. And maybe they were just playing it up, maybe they didn't hate Paul that much. For a fun tidbit, do you know that Geese walked out of the bar without paying for any of his drinks? Not that it matters, he freaking earned it. Next up, getting to Viera. So I called it, the anime skipped their sad story. So here's the reason why Viera wears that bikini armor. For her situation, she actually got teleported to the Millis continent. She then got captured by some bandits that made her their plaything. And yes, it's what it sounds like. She did manage to escape that nightmare situation, and even put that behind her through willpower. Her sister, on the other hand, wasn't so fortunate. that she still trembled at even a man just looking at her, which gets into why Viera dons the bikini armor. She did it on purpose to draw the attention of every guy. She would rather take the burden than have other women in their squad subjected to more trauma. And really, just to clear any doubt from Paul, he did confirm they didn't have any sort of iffy relationship. For another fun bar moment skipped, Paul was feeling the bar pressure, which made him crack. He shouted that he would go make up with Rudy the next day. As for Rudy's sister, Norn, Paul really did feel sad for her. That the girl was always smiling, that if he ever lost her, he wouldn't have the strength to keep on living. All of this actually led into Paul realizing, and it really sinking in, how differently he treated Rudy. What if Rudy had been an ordinary 11-year-old kid? Wouldn't he be treating both of their kids the same right now? Geese's line about Rudy still being a kid finally sunk in. For an anime change up here, you do have that water scene. Paul in this moment was supposed to be hurling too, which would have been a nice parallel to Rudy from the previous episode. Next morning, time to kiss up. Here's some fun info. Rudy and friends were actually drinking isekai coffee. Maybe Mushoku-lan isn't so bad. Anyway, getting into the meat of things. Initially, Rudy did come out and admit him just playing around, that he never actually bothered to try to gather information, that he could actually spare the moment to find out more about this disaster. To be fair, there is some truth in this. Rudy went on to mention that he couldn't begin to understand how Paul could feel at this moment. Paul had been desperately fighting trying to find his family for 2 years, while Rudy on the other hand was traveling blissfully while being ignorant. Rudy did admit this being an easy journey, that Richard had been their bodyguard against monsters despite being on the demon continent, he always helped to hunt their lunch, and even played the role of babysitter when Eris got out of control. This journey had been virtually stress-free. For a different anime skip, you did have Paul going over their home situation post-Magical Nuke, that everything was gone. All the buildings, every resident, a lot of death had been confirmed, but still a lot of people were unaccounted for. Paul went on to explain his hopes for Rudy, that he had left a message in all the cities around the world. He was hoping they could split up and search for their family members separately. To which Rudy really just found he screwed up even more. Sure, the guy was a kid, but really at heart he was an adult. If he had seen Paul's message, he would have been searching. That it was entirely possible that along the journey across the demon continent, it was very possible that Rudy might have passed up one of his family members. Just the thought of that made him regret everything he had done up until this point. For an unfortunate different anime skip, Rudy did ask about his Emoto, how is Norn doing? Turns out that the little girl had been adjusting. She was practically the squad mascot at this point. Out of this whole entire mess, at least that was one of the few positives. Norn was safe and happy. I do want to mention how much I love the anime depiction of Rudy and Paul. Their situation's so similar. I thought this was great even without Rudy spelling it all out. Visually, you were able to see Rudy play out the same situation in Paul's shoes. Ultimately, this was a turning point for Rudy, that he wasn't the same person he was back then, that he decided he was going to change, hadn't he? He couldn't keep on repeating the same mistake over and over. Light Novel Rudy did confirm that unlike Paul, his previous buddy never returned, they never saw each other again. Aww, and for the actual family reunion, just to confirm, Paul did smell like some divine juices. All of this talk is actually making my thirst act up. Right here, Rudy did in fact confirm Paul being way thinner. Must be that bum booze diet. That his body was like a size or two smaller than before. All things considering, let's be honest, Paul didn't look physically too bad. The anime then skipped their following conversation after their tearful reunion, like they brought up the fun topic about the 2 wives. It turns out that Paul was really on this short leash. 2 ladies did not mean 2 times the fun. In general, Paul was expected to keep hands off Lilia. The only exception would be if the first blonde got pregnant again. It is funny Rudy being jelly right now. Maybe someday, little dude. On the other hand, none of them wanted to touch the dreadful topic. Were the 2 wives even alive at this point? For a different lady here, you did get a Sylphie update. That Sylphie kept up with her morning routine. In the afternoon, she would practice her healing magic. Somewhere throughout all of this, Rudy did happen to bring up the topic about his goddess treasure. Whatever happened to Roxy's undies? Sorry, Rudy, time to get a new pair. Naturally, eventually the topic of Eris would be brought up. Rudy went ahead and explained the whole situation, which actually showcases further growth. Eris did promise they could go to the next base when she turned 15. But even then, if she wasn't ready, Rudy would wait. This actually gets into something about Paul that was not at all obvious in the anime. He was already assuming that Rudy would be marrying into their family. Gotta get that cousin love. This ultimately explained why Paul would jump to the conclusion that Rudy and Eris were a couple already. So this is interesting. What about Sylphie? Would it be her or Eris? Rudy admitted that he did care about Sylphie. Sylphie felt more like a little sister or even a daughter to Rudy. Perhaps they could have had something, but they did part before those feelings could develop into anything more. So between the two, Eris or Sophie, the answer would have to be the redhead. That he spent more time with Eris, she had been part of his life much longer. That it was easier to fall in love with someone that you spent a long time with, which I think speaks so well. I don't think people realize this soon enough. But back to the Sophie topic, she was still able to use healing magic without incantations. Outside of the Millis continent, this meant she was very valuable as a healer. A major piece of information here is Sophie able to cast healing spells without chance. That this was something that even Rudy was not capable of. I don't think it's too obvious in the anime, but he still does have to chant to use healing magic. For an anime change-up, you did have the two female buddies coming to get Paul. Another skip regarding Eris was Paul bringing up a suggestion. How about just assigning bodyguards to her? That way Rudy could stay here on this continent instead. No surprise, Rudy denied this request. For Eris and his own sake. He couldn't fall back on the habit of leaving this job half done. Besides, Richard Michael Aquaman on his ass. As for that money bag that Rudy got, their butler had actually entrusted them with funds to use for any member of the Eris family, which really just meant Rudy was freaking rich. He got 20 King's dollars. Rudy estimated it being around 1,000,000 yen, or just under $9,000. According to Paul, this amount of money wouldn't last you a lifetime, but it was enough to build you a house in the south. For Rudy trying to get himself cancelled, he did make a remark about how this girl was modest, but apparently she had a big brain. For an anime change continued, you did have Paul and Rudy originally partying at the bar. He did notice how his papa looked with two young females next to him. Don't be too hard on him, Rudy. At this moment, Rudy was really thankful to Eris, that if she hadn't comforted him the previous night, he might have not been able to patch things up with Papa. Speaking about the devil, you saw Eris with that black eye. It wasn't just her falling down the stairs. Mad Dog Eris was really living up to her name and strength. He needed to punch Eris now to stop her. The girl was just getting too strong. So getting into their meeting, here is a change up to their plans and priorities. Going forward, they now would be staying around a week at the major towns they visited. They no longer needed to focus on money, so they would focus on trying to get intel. Then, getting into what seems to be an anime plot point change. Originally they brought up the sensitive issue. How would they even be able to afford to cross the sea? You know, Richard. At this, Richard busted out an envelope. It was the one he was about to show Richard in the previous episode the previous day, but the anime cut that out. It was a letter from some acquaintance of Richard. On the other hand, now anime Rudy said the crossing would be no problem due to the letter he already has on hand. I'm suspecting the anime is going to be cutting a certain plot point revolved around their crossing, most likely to speed things up. I don't mind this change up, but it did involve something involving Eris, so for her sake I do hope they keep some of this. For another anime change, or should I say speed up, Rudy originally mentioned still sticking in the town for a week. In the anime, they were now leaving the next day, which now means the anime completely skipped out what Rudy was doing for the entire week. Let me try to speedrun through it. You did have Rudy visiting Paul at their headquarters the next morning. The result for this was them setting up this dinner time for a later date. At this point, his sister, Norn, was still not at all happy with Rudy. For some world building for the Millis capital, nearby monsters included a giant locust, this carnivorous bunny, and some overgrown earthworm. They were really not dangerous. You also got some info about this Millis group, that there was this political faction within the city that really hated demonkind. Their leader was associated with the Temple Knights. In present day, this party was not in control of Millis. In fact, the current pope was actually in favor for coexistence with demons. Next anime skip, we actually had Rudy taking on this B-rank quest, time to take out this leaf tiger. In comparison, this thing was less of a threat than your average acid wolf. In other words, no problem. For a different skip, you actually had Rudy trying to push those rigid figures onto the people. And these people being followers of the Millis Church, they really had no interest in this demon statue. It's actually funny since Rudy considered making Richard into best girl. Waifu figures do sell. Next anime skip, Eris and Rudy going on this shopping date. Which makes sense, they're now traveling in the human territory. Trying to get some neat clothing so people wouldn't treat them weirdly. All of this was ultimately leading up to the main anime skip, which was dinner time with Rudy, Paul, and Eris. The anime already had Paul and Eris meet, not to mention Eris's rant on Paul severely cut down. For this, I would highly suggest checking out the light novel, and I'm not a big fan of it, but you do have a manga version of this fun, awkward dinner talk. It's not really at all accurate to the light novel events though, especially with the sister stuff. Some of the highlights included Norn still hitting on Rudy. Rudy ultimately figured it was impossible to reason with her right now. She's only like 3. Some fun here included Rudy joking around that both father and son should kiss. The ultimate showcase of love. For a change of topic, they did bring up Rudy's sweet 10th birthday. Paul did confirm that originally they did want to head over. The issue was that monsters in the forest had been overactive lately before then. Paul originally wanted to get Rudy a pair of gauntlets. It was his magic item from the labyrinth. Whatever gift Venus planned was a secret, while Lilia just looked at this small box with a smile on her face. For some Skip family info, unfortunately it turned out that her grandparents had basically disowned her after she left home, so they weren't too happy about helping to actually search for her. On the flip side, they did do a 180 once they actually got a look at Norn. The power of cute. For some subtle Eris development, she actually restrained herself in front of Paul, even though she did want to slice his nuts off. Anyway, getting to the takeoff day. For a Skip Eris moment, Ruijerd was already holding her ready, just in case she wanted to try something against Paul. Then for the Skip Saros and Philip topic. Unfortunately, even if these two did make it back alive, there was no telling what would happen to them after this disaster. It actually wouldn't have been surprising if someone had tried to take them out quietly. For a new anime plotline, you did have the Ruijerd figures being left behind. So this plot point is still around for the anime, just changed up. Then for good guy Geese heading to the continent left over. It is interesting to see that Paul thought he hated him. After all, their party breaking up had practically forced Geese to retire. At the end of this, you did see Paul refueled and feeling determined. Once this whole relocation operation went off, Paul would be back at it trying to find his family. It didn't matter what it took. So, awesome episode. Did you cry too? Do you think too much was cut? Did you enjoy watching this longer video? Whatever you're feeling, post it below. I do read all the comments. And as always, I do highly recommend the Mushoku Tensei light novel. You can find it over at Bookwalker. Just use my code FOXEN and get a sweet $5 discount. Oh, and they got the manga too. If you're craving more Mushoku Tensei the anime skip, go check out my Roxy video. It is non-spoiler for the current anime events. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next anime video, and I'll see you guys later.